Hello, and welcome to the RISE UP Buttercup Podcast, where we have one mission: to empower women across the world.
And I'm saying no way, I'm going my own way, and you can't stop me, 'cause I'm loving myself, oh no way, this is my own way, and you can't stop me, 'cause I'm loving myself.
Hello, my friend. Welcome to another episode of the RISE UP Buttercup Podcast. If it's your first time here, hello, welcome. My name's Amy Gerhartz. I am a coach. I'm also your host for the podcast. And today we're going to talk all about ways that you can stop overthinking and start taking action. Now, contrary to last week's episode, which was about slowing down and staying present, we're going to switch directions here just a little bit and really talk about that one thing that myself and so many of my clients, and possibly even you, if you're watching this episode or listening to this episode, is that there is a tendency to overthink, to overanalyze. And what ends up happening is when we start overthinking things, instead of it being a productive thought pattern, it ends up spiraling a little out of control. At least it does for me. And I end up in a space of paralysis. And chances are you probably end up in a space of paralysis too by overthinking and overanalyzing and second guessing and questioning and all of these things. And so if you're someone who's found yourself in the paralysis by analysis, then I have some tools today that I think are really going to support you, because I know they have supported me, especially if you also have ADD, which, oh my goodness, I have very strongly. I wasn't diagnosed with ADD until I was in my early 30s, and now I'm in my early 40s. And I've got to learn many different tools along the way to support me with that chaos of the mind sometimes, and to help me control some of the overthinking that actually happens so that I can take action on my life, so that I can do the things that I want to do, and also the things that I need to do, or that I would consider necessities for my own survival. So if any of this sounds like you, or perhaps someone you know, this is going to be a great episode, because my goal and intention is to give you some practical, very easy to follow steps to support you with that overthinking, slowing it down, and actually taking those first few steps to move forward. So before we dive into the tips today, I want to talk a little bit more about overthinking and the different ways that it can actually manifest itself. And the one thing I want to get very, very clear in this episode is that I am by no means telling you not to think something through. I'm not telling you that you shouldn't plan things out, or that you shouldn't take time to assess situations or tasks. But what I'm talking about today when we talk about overthinking is the overuse of that skill set. When you've gone past the analysis, when you've gone past the assessment of a situation or a task or a situation, and you found yourself going almost too far into overuse, right? To where you're freezing, to where you're not actually moving. And I've seen this manifest itself in a couple of different ways. One is more of the perfectionism state. I've got to have things perfect before I can take any action whatsoever. They've got to be really, really put together. I've got to make sure I'm putting out my best work. I've got to make sure I'm doing this the best that I possibly can. And I don't know if you've heard this term, but perfectionism is just procrastination in disguise. And I'm going to say that again because I want it to sink in. Perfectionism is just procrastination in disguise. And if you've listened to my podcast before, you'll know that I don't necessarily believe in perfectionism. I don't believe there's any such thing as perfect, because even things that I do to the best of my abilities today, in 5 years from now or 10 years from now, I'm going to learn more and be able to do them even better 5 years from now or 10 years from now. So I'm constantly in this state of improvement. And so therefore, this idea of making it perfect, quote unquote, in my opinion, just in my experience, is a little ridiculous, because there is no such thing as perfect, because we're constantly growing, constantly evolving. But I've seen clients and people I know overanalyze to the point and overthink things to the point where they are looking for perfectionism. They're looking for something that, quite frankly, doesn't exist, because there is no such thing. No human being in the world, unless you believe in a higher power, there's no such thing as perfect, right? So let's take that as just one example. Another way that I've seen this manifest is this idea of proactive versus responsive. And I've seen so many people that are not proactive with taking action, but they're more responsive with taking action. So what do I mean by this? And I saw this all of the time in my music career. It was crazy to me how many people would come up and say, "Oh, Amy, how did you book shows, and how did you tour across the country, and how did you build a fan base, and how did you put out albums?" And I would tell them exactly what I did so that they could do it too. And then I would get this, "Oh, well, I really need a manager to do that." Or when I have the record label, I'll do that. When I have the publishing deal, I'll do that. So instead of being proactive, I've seen so many people overthink things to a responsive space of saying, "I'll do this, I'll respond and take action once I have these things lined up. Once I have this put together, then I'll be responsive," right? And in fact, I'm even guilty of this. For a long time, something I wanted to do for many years was go on a mission trip with my church. And I told myself in my head, "Oh, I'll do that when I'm older. Oh, that'll be something really nice to do in retirement. Oh, when I get to this level financially, then I'll take the time off to do it." And when I finally had this aha moment, and this was about a year or so ago, I had this moment. I was sitting in church and they were doing this whole, mission trip recap. And I thought, what are you waiting for? What are you waiting for? And so instead of being responsive and waiting for a certain mile marker in my life to take action, I booked the trip. I went on the mission trip, and it was probably one of the most amazing experiences of my life. And I'm going on another trip again this year. I never would have done that had I sat around waiting for these certain mile markers to happen, or waiting for something else to trigger a response out of me versus being proactive and taking that initiative. So these are just a few different ways. Oh, and then maybe the final way as well, if we're really going to go into it, and probably the first tip I'm going to go into for you today, is the emotional response, right, that comes up from it. Because I've seen so many people, myself included, overthink things from an emotional state. And usually it's based underneath, there's a fear or some sort of discomfort or hesitation that's causing someone to overthink until they feel comfortable enough to then take action, right? So you've got sort of these three different areas, and sometimes they can cross over with each other. But the first, the perfectionism, right? The second is the overthinking until there's a responsive action that's taken, or a responsive approach. And then there's the emotional overthinking too, like the what if this doesn't work out, or what if I'm not good enough, or the what if, people see right through me and I'm an imposter. And we have all of this internal dialogue that comes into this overthinking. So today, as I said, thanks for being with me still at this point of the podcast. I want to give you some tools to push through these three different areas of overthinking, these three different areas of paralysis, so that you can actually take action and start moving forward in your life. So the first tip I have for you today, which I think is probably one of the most important ones, and you can also go back to last week's episode and listen to the slowing down and staying present. But normally when we get into a space of overthinking, we're firing our brains on multiple cylinders at a time, right? Our brains are constantly going, we're thinking about this, we're thinking about this, we're thinking about this, we're thinking about this, especially if you're someone who has ADD like myself. So the first thing I would say is, when you find yourself in that state of overthinking, the first thing I want you to do is just take a quick pause and breathe. Whenever we breathe and we take time to just focus on breathing, and you'll see this a lot in meditation, you'll see this in hypnosis, hypnotherapy, whenever we can focus inward for just a moment and take a minute to focus on our breath, we start to lower our heart rate. We start to lower our need to go very quickly. We start to slow down just a minute, just enough to redirect our focus. And that's a big thing we're going to talk about today is redirecting focus. Because when we are focused on the overthinking, we're not focused on the taking action. And so therefore, we want to be able to shift our focus towards taking action. So the first step I have for you today is when you find yourself spiraling in this overthinking, take a second to breathe. Take a second to ground yourself, to center with yourself. What I like to do is a paced breathing. So I'll do 4 count inhale and then a 4 count exhale. You can also do a 4 count inhale, a 2 count hold of your breath, then a 4 count exhale. You can play around with different numbers of breathing in and breathing out and counting. What you're doing once again in this moment is you're shifting your focus off of the things you're thinking about. You're shifting your focus away. You're shifting it back internally. So this is really, really, really powerful. In fact, you can take a minute right now and pause this episode and just practice breathing for 30 seconds. Just practice breathing and pause the episode and see if that even supports you right here in this moment with taking a second to slow down, taking a second to reground yourself. The second thing I really want to point out to you today is that in our last episode, once again, I know I keep referencing this, but if you listen to these, sequentially, then you'll have heard me talk about an NLP technique called association and dissociation. Association means to attach, dissociation means to detach. And in last week's episode about staying present, I taught you how to associate or be in the movie, right? If you're thinking of the movie screen scenario or watching a movie, you can either be watching the movie from the outside or you can be in the movie. And when you're in the movie, you're associating with the feelings, with the emotion, with the experience. For the sake of today, I want us to go in the opposite direction of that and use dissociation. So once we've accessed our breathing, once we've assessed and grounded ourselves and we've taken a minute to focus in on our breathing and calm ourselves down just a little bit, then I want us to dissociate outside of ourselves. Now, I want us to detach for the sole purpose of removing the emotional connection. Let me say that again. I want us to dissociate and detach only for the sole purpose of removing the emotional connection or attempting to remove the emotional connection behind the overthinking. And this is really, really, really important because once again, if you're anything like me, sometimes my emotions can come into play with overthinking because when I start thinking about all the different things that I could do or have to do or whatever it is, and I'm not taking action, I'm spinning my wheels in this state of overwhelm and chaos mentally and emotionally. And then I start feeling myself get more stressed. I start feeling myself get more anxious and I start finding my brain living in this space of chaos where I don't quite know what to do next. So whenever I feel these emotions start to build up and this overthinking start to build up, it's important for me to remember I can detach away from this. I can dissociate out. And what we're looking to do here is that when you find yourself in this chaos, you can go back to the movie scenario. You can put your life up on a movie screen or pretend it's on a movie screen about 10 to 20 feet in front of you and then just watch it through as a, non-biased person watching your own life, watching your movie. Another thing you can do is take the 30,000 foot view, which you've probably heard people talk about before, is where you just pretend that you're 30,000 feet above yourself and you're just looking down and you're observing your life. However you can do it mentally to dissociate and detach, what you're then doing is you're intentionally removing your focus away from the emotional pull that's actually happening in the moment from the overthinking. So when you dissociate and you pull out, what that actually helps you to do is to see things just a little bit more objectively, see things a little bit more clearly. And for example, if you're someone similar to me where I know that I can get wound up in the chaos of the day and the overthinking of the day. And I've got to do this and I've got to do this and I got to do this and I got to do this. And I don't even know where to start. And oh my gosh, I'm just, all these things happening together at once. I can then go into that paralysis mode of not doing anything or trying to do way too many things that things don't get done efficiently or effectively. And so if I can remove myself out of the equation and look at my life objectively, I can see all of the moving parts a little more clearly. And what's really great about this is that when I can see all the moving parts clearly, and when you take a minute to step outside of yourself and look at everything objectively, you'll be able to assess, once again, you've probably heard me talk about this, what's important versus what is not important right now, right? So for me, if I get into the overthinking of, oh my gosh, my mom's coming in town and I got to clean my apartment and I've got to make sure that I, have clean sheets on the bed and I've got to do all this stuff. I can sit back and say, why am I getting so stressed about things that get to be unemotional? And then I get to remind myself this little phrase, this gets to be unemotional. This is just a task. I don't have to attach emotion to doing dishes. I don't have to attach emotion to making my bed. I don't have to attach emotion to sending an email or doing a work project, right? I get to realize that a task is just a task when I dissociate out. But here's the thing, listener. When we are in this state of chaos, it's really difficult for us to see the forest from the trees. Right? It's really difficult for us to pull ourselves out of the emotion. So breathing, redirecting our focus, and then dissociating out and trying to see your life from 30,000 feet above, or maybe it's out on the movie screen in front of you and you're just watching it. And you can also manipulate the movie too. If you do choose to use this movie screen scenario, you can play the situation of your life, whatever it is that you're overthinking, in black and white. You can play it in color. You can fast forward it. You can rewind it. You can manipulate the way you're seeing it to detach the emotional connection. That is the biggest part of dissociation, is to detach intentionally so that you can make the next step, so you can take the next step, so you can take some sort of action in your life without sitting in that paralysis, right? Without sitting in the perfectionism or the paralysis or the waiting for something to happen. Because once again, I don't know if you're like me, when I get into that chaos and overwhelm, I just want to shut down. Like, I know myself well enough that I've used these tools to keep me from shutting down. I've used these tools to keep me from going into hibernation mode because it's safe and it's comfortable. And the two things that your brain really wants, or the one thing that your brain really wants, is for you to be safe. And it probably also wants you to be comfortable. It doesn't want you to put yourself out there or try something different because it shocks your programming. And so we get to learn, when it comes to taking action, how to calm down the emotions, how to calm down the emotional response. So these are your first two tips. Once again, taking some time to assess your breathing. If you're finding yourself overthinking and your brain's going a million miles an hour, just take a quick pause, maybe 30 seconds, and focus in on your breathing, because you're distracting your focus mentally. The second thing is to work on dissociation or detachment, so that you can disconnect the emotional trigger of what you're going through. And then once you've gotten to this space where you're like, okay, I think this gets to be incredibly unemotional, right? A task is just a task. A podcast is just a podcast. A recording is just a recording. An email is just an email. Your phone call is just a phone call. I don't have to overthink, and I don't have to emotionally get charged when I do these things. Then when it comes to what you are doing and you see the big picture, you can cut out the excess, the unimportant things that you're overthinking about, or depending on how you look at it, or you can start to reverse engineer your priorities. So what do I mean by that? Let's say you've got a big project coming up, right? And you are really concerned about how you're going to get everything done. You want it to be perfect. You are feeling emotionally charged. You're overthinking everything. If you know where you want to end up, you can reverse engineer the steps to get there. So you can say, all right, if this is where I want to end up, what's the first step? So I love using weight loss or fat loss as an example because so many of my female clients struggle with their body and their weight. And I'm not a fitness expert by any means, but it's a really relatable analogy here. Let's say you want to release 10 pounds, right? Well, if you want to release 10 pounds, what's the first step you got to take to get there, right? Okay, maybe it is signing up for a gym membership, right? Or a program or getting support from a trainer or a nutrition program. And then, so maybe that's the first step. Okay. And so maybe you've hired the trainer. What's the next step? Okay. Well, I got to go to the store and buy all the food. Okay. Well, what's the next step after that? Well, I got to go to the gym. Oh, wait a minute. I can't go to the gym until I have workout clothes or sneakers or whatever it is that I need. So you can start breaking down this end goal into these tiny chunks of priority and really focus on what is the next step that I have to do? What is the next step I get to take? And a little bit different, but also relatable. I love Glennon Doyle and her book and the what's the next right move? What's the next right thing? You can ask yourself that question too. I think it's a brilliant question to ask. What's the next right thing to do right now? What's the next important thing that I get to do right now? And if you focus in when you've got all of these things floating around in your brain and you're overthinking life and you're overthinking planning and you're overthinking all the things, you can say, what's the one thing I can do right now unemotionally that's going to move the needle for me in that next, like in the direction I want to go to? What's the one thing I can focus on right now unemotionally that's going to get me to where I want to be? That is a great question you get to ask yourself. What is the one thing I can do right now that's going to get me to where I want to be without having the emotions attached? And then you just focus on taking one step at a time, one step at a time, one step at a time. Listener, I know this was a lot of information today, but I want to give you a little bit of a silver lining here because once again, if you're anything like me, sometimes the hardest part is just getting into movement. Sometimes the most challenging aspect of getting anything accomplished is just taking those first steps. And then once I'm able to take those first steps, I have found for myself, for my clients, it's like I've just been given permission and I take off. I'm able to accomplish so many things just by taking the first step. And it doesn't mean I don't ever get into paralysis. And it doesn't mean I don't ever have breakdowns, but I get to remind myself once again, this is not emotional. This is just take the first step, just keep going. Don't worry about overthinking. If you have a brain that is constantly active, chances are it's probably always going to be constantly active. So it's going to take intentional effort from you to redirect focus and to slow it down. And once again, detach emotionally. The more you can detach the emotions from a task, from a very simple, easy task, the more you can detach those emotions, the easier it's going to be to complete that task. So I hope this supports you today. If you have any questions about this episode, feel free to comment or reach out to me over at ahigherwayofliving.com. I'm happy to clear up any of those questions you might have. I know it was a lot of information and 25, 30 minutes-ish. So I want you to know that you're not alone. You don't have to do this by yourself. If you need any extra support, you can always book a call with me. I think we have a few spots open for coaching as well in my calendar with clients. And we have group programs that we're launching here too. So make sure you stay in touch with us. If you're someone who right now is struggling with kind of getting prioritized, or maybe you're even struggling with that self-confidence and that motivation, check out some of the free gifts in the description below. And once again, like I said, you can reach out anytime. So I hope this helped you today. And remember, you are one of a kind and absolutely worth it. And I'll see you next time.